Welcome back. It is Bones. And in this one, we're going to do another versus video. Now, I have done a couple of these. I did DC Essentials, I did DC Icons, and this is a highly anticipated one. I did get a couple of requests to do this one. And although I wanted to do this one, I just wanted to make sure I had the right figures to do it with. Now, I know a lot of people could think, oh, but Bones, you're biased for Mcfarlane. You love Mcfarlane. Wrong, wrong. I collect DC Multiverse. I don't collect every line or everything that Mcfarlane puts out. And at the same time, I love DC Universe Classics. So I'm not biased for either side. I'm just going to look at them straight up, what they come with, their articulation, the fun and posability, and the aesthetics of the figure. But this is going to be the long-awaited DC Universe Classics versus Mcfarlane DC Multiverse. Now, I did pick the Silver Age Hal Jordan, particularly because they have the same costume design, more or less. They're trying to capture the same image of Hal Jordan. And I just thought they were the more comparable figures. You can decide on using a bunch of different figures to compare, Mattel's DC Universe Classics to McFarlane's DC Multiverse. But I just thought this was basically your equal setup where these figures basically represent what each line is going for, the design and the execution. So this is going to be it. The legendary Battle of the Giants. And of course, we're going to bring out Hal Jordan from the DC Universe Classics. Now, this version of Hal Jordan came in a 2-pack with Abin Sur. And although I do also have that figure, something that DC Universe Classics is known for, and a lot of companies do, is their reuse. So if you were to swap heads on these, you would not tell the difference. They are the exact same figure. The only difference being that Abin Sur has a more alien head sculpt. And on the other side of the ring, you do have McFarlane's Silver Age version of Hal Jordan. Also a representation of this costume. Hal Jordan has a couple of costumes. The more modern design where the shoulders are painted. You have metallic green versions of Hal Jordan. This is a more plain, original, classic costume of Hal Jordan, but they do have basically the same costume design. And although McFarlane has branched out and we do have the modern Hal Jordan, which really one of my favorite McFarlane figures, I still kind of prefer this one to this Silver Age version, but the best part about it is I can enjoy both of these figures. We also did get the Parallax version of Hal Jordan, which DC Universe Classics never even attempted. And although you do have a figure from DC Direct, that one has way less articulation. If you want to understand that, look up my DC Direct versus DC Multiverse video. And that takes me into talking about DC Classics. They just used the same Hal Jordan buck, the same head sculpt, and painted it up differently. I think when you got into the Black Lantern, they did a different Hal Jordan head sculpt, which was really nice, as an angry, screaming head sculpt. But for most of the Hal Jordan figures, this is what they used. They just repainted it. So when McFarlane decides to do that with this version, I really don't want to hear people complaining about reuse. DC Classics was about 80% of this body book. Batman, The Flash, Superman, everybody had the same body except for characters that were very different from the large male frame. And that made up a majority of their line. So I just don't want to hear it when we see reuse. I'm tired of it. But let's compare each figure. Now, taking a look at the Hal Jordan, they did capture that old school Hal Jordan. Once again, because this figure was easily modified into a more modern version. But you get that classic Hal Jordan head sculpt, classic costume, and your basic DC Classics buck. Now, we will go into accessories, but that'll be after we take a look at the figures. And looking at this Hal Jordan head sculpt, this was sculpted by Four Horsemen, and for the most part, they did a great job on a lot of the DC Universe Classics head sculpts. The only negative I would say is a lot of times the heads came out looking kind of flat. This one is no exception. When you turn them to the side, you can kind of see how that flatness begins to show itself. And there were some worse head sculpts, and there were some ones that you couldn't really tell that were different, which is something that is regular to all lines. You got some hits and you got some misses. Jumping us right into the DC Multiverse version of Hal Jordan. Now they went for the same classic Silver Age costume. And while the DC Classics costume is a little darker, this one has a tiny brighter shade of green. They are comparable and they were both going for the same look. And as we said, this body book is the Blue Beetle Booster Gold body book, which Mcfarlane has used a good amount of times, and I'm sure he's going to keep using it because it's one of his more plain body books for characters. But at the same time, he still has tons of original scope, tons of different versions of characters, so that does not worry me at all or bother me at all that they do some reuse. Taking a look at this Hal Jordan's head sculpt, one thing I do like about this head sculpt, besides the fact that it looks like a human head sculpt, it doesn't have that flat look that the DC Classics does. They gave him a little bit of a smirk, which really coincides with Hal Jordan's character. He has a sort of a devil may care attitude. He's a daredevil. He's out there flying jets before he went to patrol the cosmos as a Green Lantern. So he definitely has a part of his attitude that is, a little bit cocky and a little bit fun. So they gave him that little attitude just with a little bit of sculpt work on the mouth. So I definitely have to say that round one definitely goes to DC Multiverse, only because the head sculpt looks fuller and they gave him a little bit of character that you can easily feel coming off of that head sculpt. Now, taking a look at the paint on the suit design, Hal Jordan has a clean Green Lantern core symbol. Now, there is a difference with these, and I really prefer the DC Universe Classics because it has that really thin black borderline around the symbol. It's just something that I prefer, and I feel it looks a lot better. While the Mcfarlane one does have a clean, crisp paint job and is going for that same classic emblem, the difference is it does not have that little black outline, which would go a long way to make these symbols pop off of the costume. So, hey, sometimes the sun shines on even a dog's butt. So I'll kind of give the edge to DC Classics just on the symbol of the costume. But in a totality, when you move down to take a look at the body and midsection, you can really start seeing the lines that DC Universe Classics has because of that old design and production. You could just see how it breaks up a lot. While when you look at Mcfarlane's, it has clean lines with minimal breaks, really helped along by the fact that he has trunks instead of having that cut up abdomen section that the DC Universe Classics all had. Now let's get into articulation and we will start off with the head. DC Universe Classics is known for having minimal head articulation. They were using that old one plug bar, that didn't give any movement at the lower part of the figure. So as far as looking down, he has pretty good articulation, but looking up with a lot of DC Universe Classics figures is a no-go. They didn't really look up that well, and that is throughout the line. You could look right to left pretty easily, but another negative is there is no tilting of the head at all due to that single bar. So the articulation is very limited. Now, when you jump over to McFarlane's DC Multiverse, he can look down, he can look way up, which is great. He can look right to left, and he can tilt his head to give each figure a little bit of attitude and character. So, once again, gotta give the head articulation to DC Multiverse. Now let's jump right into the waist articulation. DC Universe Classics, you're not going to get any side to side. You're not going to get any tilt-a-whirl. You're, you're not going to get too much movement in the waist because they use that ugly old cut waist. And when you do turn it, it looks pretty horrible. Now you could look past this and keep them in a prone pose, but that kind of takes away from the fun posability of the figure. While he does have a slight ab crunch, it's not as much as people would think because it has the same, waist hinge that a lot of Marvel Legends use, but it doesn't go as deep as you would think. It has a minimal forward crunch. Going back is fine, but either way you look at it, it is a pretty horrible design for any action figure's waist articulation. Now, McFarlane has been doing this from the beginning with his waist, and he does have multiple ball hinges in his figures, so you get a nice side to side movement. You get a full tilt-a-whirl at the waist, giving you a lot of range and movement. You can twist them, get them in cool poses, and it doesn't break up the sculpt. Definitely looks really beautiful compared to the old waist cut that companies still use, which is a shocker to me. You got lower waist swivel, upper chest swivel, so much articulation, and it doesn't break up the figure's lines at all. Now, this one has a generous forward crunch. McFarlane is known for not giving figures a forward crunch. Coming out of that a little bit with recent releases, more figures are starting to get more of a forward crunch. So luckily, this Hal Jordan does have a nice crunch. So once again, easily goes to DC Multiverse in waist articulation. Going down to the legs, let's take a look at the DC Universe Classics. Once again, looks fine when it's standing on the shelf, but as soon as you start articulating it, you start seeing the flaws. They have that ugly thigh gap right on the inner thighs that all DC Universe Classics figures have. They all have this, even the large figures, and it looks horrendous, not appealing at all. That's why you can't really pose the DC Universe Classics figures. And although he does have a nice range, he could kick up this far, could kick back a little. Single jointed knees really takes it down. Up and down at the ankle, and no swivel at all, except for that really bad looking quad cut that DC Universe Classics use. They don't have a thigh cut, they have a quad cut. They cut it right at the quad. And even when you try and turn it to give some movement to the lower leg, it really looks bad. Just don't like the way it looks. Now going with DC Multiverse, one thing they have that a lot of people don't talk about, and although you do need to heat them up sometimes and loosen it up, they have an awesome thigh swivel. You can move the thighs from left to right without having any ugly cuts in the leg sculpt. Now, I'm not against thigh cuts, but I really prefer when they are hidden by some sort of design in the costume and not when you just cut like right through the muscle. I'm just not a fan of that. But what it allows is for you to move the boot from side to side. He can kick up really high, can kick back really far as well. because the trunks are made of rubber and they get out of the way. And when you put them back, they go back to their original shape. I heard somebody complaining that I'm sure if you leave it bent like that for a long period of time, it won't go back. Well, it does go back eventually. And you can also get a hair dryer and hit it with a little bit of heat and it goes back really quickly. So it's not a detriment to the figure to have the soft plastic trunks. It is actually an advantage to the figure. At the same time, it keeps a clean look, as I said before. Although DC Universe Classics has pretty much that comic book hero look in the midsection, once you start articulating it, it just, completely destroys it. While DC Multiverse has those lines that are cool, like in the comics, without a lot of gapping in between the thighs, and you can still articulate it and get movement, and it maintains those lines. Now, this will just, kick DC Universe Classics in the butt, and that is that he has double jointed knees. He has up and down at the ankle, right to left. He even has rocker, and of course, Mcfarlane. Mostly all of them have toe articulation. No painted on boot cuff here, like the DC Classic. This one has sculpted boot cuts and is just a more appealing design for the lower body and the ankles when you compare the two side by side. Now, going into the shoulders, DC Universe Classics, no movement at the shoulder. You do have a bicep cut and single jointed elbows. The wrists only swivel in one direction, and you're basically locked into these hands, which is one grasping hand and one fist with the ring on it, which looks very good. DC Multiverse, on the other hand, you have a bushing and socket shoulder joint where you get a lot of range and movement. You can move it up and down, front to back. You also have a pretty nice bicep swivel and double jointed elbows. And, and these elbows look really good. They don't look so choppy as some of the early Mcfarlane figures. So they have a nice clean form through the elbow. Plus, the added articulation is definitely appreciated. And when you move down to the wrist, doesn't get any better for DC Classics. Mcfarlane actually has 4 ways of articulation. You can hinge and swivel and still rotate the wrist and get another added swivel at the wrist. And on the other side, he also has the ring. You could see the lantern ring sculpted out very nicely on that fist from Mcfarlane. So to break it down really simply, DC Universe Classics had a little bit of fight in them, but they did get a mud hole stomped in them by DC Multiverse in articulation. Now, going into posability, once again, as soon as you start posing the DC Classics, you start seeing the flaws. I mean, I own all of these figures. They're right here in front of me, and they look great standing on the shelf. But once you get into figure photography and clean lines and posability and being photogenic, it definitely has to go to DC Multiverse once again. Just the ultra articulation, the design, the clean lines make these figures so much more fun to do figure photography or do setups and displays. It's just no contest, really. So this is pretty much turning out to be a landslide victory for DC Multiverse. And don't even get me started in accessories, because for some reason in the 2-pack, they gave the figures this lime green lantern battery. Now, I do have tons of DC Classics lanterns. I could choose from anyone. I just thought it was fitting to put the one he came with in the packaging. No alternate hands, no effects, nada. But if you don't know, that is on par with a lot of DC Universe Classics. Now, some did come with accessories. You had weapons, some had effects, but it was very rare. And another thing is no alternate hands to speak of. As far as I can remember, no DC Universe Classics figure had alternate hands. Now, you did have swappable weapons and stuff like that with the Metal Men, as far as I can remember off the top of my head. But as far as figures having interchangeable hands, it's a no go. Now, what did we get with this reasonably priced DC Multiverse figure from Mcfarlane? We did get a figure stand, which, although they're not needed, they are an appreciated bonus that we've been getting from Mcfarlane from the beginning. You also get a data file card, which is another thing not really needed, but some people collect these. And I was surprised. I was seeing a review, just a random review, and out of nowhere, the guy, he's like, I collect these. I have my, folder. And he started showing off, all of his cards. And I said, people still collect these, even though I don't. I just have them stacked up. Some people really enjoy these cards. You also get something that very controversial, very polarizing, a digital version of the figure that you can look up online. And that's really a topic for another video, because for me, it does not bother me at all. I could care less. So I waste any energy getting all, worked up about it. Doesn't mean anything to me and doesn't get my emotions riled up in the least. His version also comes with a lantern. While I will give them props for putting a lantern symbol on the top of the lantern, a lantern isn't a construct, it is a physical apparatus. So I don't know why they keep doing them in transparent plastic, but I did find something out very recently, and I'll show you guys that in a bit. Now, he also comes with two alternate hands. You have a open splayed hand, and you have a gripping hand so that he can hold his lantern. And finally, you do get some effects, although we've seen these before. I really enjoy this, tone of green that they use to mold these out in. And as always, I don't use a lot of effects, but I would rather have them and have the option than to not have them. So tons of accessories, tons of stuff you get with a comparably priced DC Multiverse from Mcfarlane figure in this day and age. I think it's, $25. So basically a $20 figure. Now, in the end, we should all have fun. If you enjoy DC Classics, collect it. I did. It was really great. Great time in my life when I first was really deep into collecting a line. But if you enjoy DC Multiverse, it is a very fun line, awesome for customizing, awesome for figure photography, getting better with each release, vehicles, expanding out into different characters, animals. I mean, we got it all. We got it all with this line. So Mcfarlane is getting very close to creeping into that best DC action figure line of all time. Now, I've said before, I'm on the edge where I want to call it, but I'm still holding off a little bit. But it is getting very obvious that you can't deny that DC Multiverse from Mcfarlane is becoming one of the premier action figure lines of all time. Now, very fun to pose. I have always told you, do not get rid of your DC Classics accessories because they go well with your DC Multiverse. I've done it over and over again. Another thing I found out is that the benefit of having these clear molded lanterns is that if you have any sort of light source, you can light them up and get that glow effect pretty simply when you're doing figure photography, or even on display if you want to set up a light to shine off of that clear transparent plastic. It is a really cool effect. And I didn't even notice that until recently. I started figuring that out, which is just another added benefit to these accessories. Now, originally, I couldn't decide what figures I wanted to use. I was really going to use this Firestorm from DC Universe Classics, and I was going to use this Firestorm from McFarlane's DC Multiverse. And as you can see, these effects come from the DC Classics, but they just look so good on this Ronnie version of Firestorm. And it's really fun to mix and match effects. But when you look at them right away, this is something I'm talking about, that it's just a landslide victory for DC Multiverse. You can look at the boots on this DC Universe Classics Firestorm. No detail, a comic look, I'll give you that. But when you compare it to the McFarlane version, you have all that added detail, all that sculpt, the buckles. The boot is actually sculpted into the figure. It's not just a painted line, which is par of the course for a lot of the lines that use the same body over and over again. And although recently McFarlane has done more reuse than before, he still has beautiful sculpt work like this Firestorm. Just an awesome, beautiful figure, blowing away this DC Universe Classics. Now, there are things I do enjoy about the DC Classics. Look at the translucent hair they did on this Firestorm. It's beautiful. For some reason, McFarlane had the urge to put a wash on on his version, which I don't understand. It would have looked better just with the clear plastic. But those are minimal things. But in a whole, with articulation, with sculpt work, with design, you just have to give it up for McFarlane's DC Multiverse. So in the end, this is what I'm going to say, is that I loved DC Universe Classics. I still do. I have them in package. I have them loose. I collected them feverishly every day. Every day I hunted down DC Universe Classics, but those days are done. They never made any vehicles. I think they made one throne. Out of all their 4 years that they ran, they never made any sort of vehicles for their figures. While on the other hand, McFarlane is, pumping out the vehicles nonstop, opening up the character selection, and improving each figure better and better each time that I purchase one. And basically, for the most part, still keeping the figures at a $20 price point. So anyways, guys, it was a win for DC Multiverse from McFarlane. I do still enjoy my collection of DC Universe Classics, but sometimes you have to know when you are beaten, and they're getting pretty close to having to say no mas. So anyways, you guys keep hunting out there, keep collecting, keep customizing, and I will see you on the next one.
Used to call me Crazy Joe, but now they can call me Batman.